Just a quick book placement, product placement for my books under the author name Derek Hemingway. First, we have the first installment in the Human Saga, which is my epic trilogy of novellas about a future civilization of corporate fascism that is being invaded by an alien cult. We have The Mortician's Daughter, a dark fantasy set in Mesoamerica about a sorceress who blocks out the sun to create a kingdom of darkness and evil, full of ghosts and monsters. It's fucking awesome. Part 2 of the Human Saga, and then part 3. There's currently my first full-length novel in the works, so be on the lookout for that. That's about all. That heathen bastard!
Alright, everybody, welcome back to That Heathen Bastard. Today we're going to talk about something that's a little more controversial. I already talk about many controversial points. But remember that this is a platform for talking points and not a news show. With that being said, let us continue on. Now, in honor of the recent information drop of 1/6 having actually been a manufactured event, seeing as how the Capitol police officer can literally be seen on video directing some bumbling Trump supporters into the Capitol in order to manufacture an insurrection, it was little more than a break-in. It was little more than a break-in. Okay? They wanted to create a straw man. They wanted to create a boogeyman to scare people with. So in honor of that, I wanted to discuss something controversial, which is why you should entertain conspiracy theories. Now, my experience with conspiracy theorists is very interesting. These individuals are not so much mentally ill or insane or crazy or anything like that. Rather, it's more that the conspiracy theorists are... These individuals are usually perfectly normal or perfectly intelligent, but their grounding in the common everyday reality is limited. They have limited grounding in reality, and that leaves them to flights of fantasy, precisely because their connection to reality is so weak. With that being said, it is not that conspiracy theorists are so disconnected from reality that nothing they say can be taken seriously. It's just that their connection with reality is weaker than yours or mine. And that can lead to temporary delusion or temporary psychosis. They're not less than you. They're not crazier than you. They're just someone who's a little lost and confused in the daily milieu of reality. And I can say this quite clearly because I've had experience with these people. I remember one guy in particular on Facebook. He was one of these rare individuals who believes they're trans species. He believes he's an alien, and so he got surgery to make himself look like an alien. And he behaved sort of alien. But he had this conspiracy theory that the Nazi doctor, Joseph Mengele, was still alive under the alias Dr. Green and worked for the Illuminati. I, of course, do what I always do when I meet a conspiracy theorist, which is I treat them with I'm very friendly towards them, very jocular. I just kind of mess with them a little bit cutely. They usually smile and nod to my jokes. And then, of course, I ask them, okay, what is the evidence for your pet conspiracy theory? And then I just wait until they have something to present me with, some evidence. And then I simply tell them, like, hey, sorry, I'm not really convinced by this. In fact, I don't know anyone who honestly would be. This gentleman in question, who was basically wanted to be trans species, basically started behaving very childishly, repeating my own messages back to me, but typed funny, and just generally acting like a child. And I responded by saying, fine, you want to act like a child, go ahead, but don't be surprised if anyone doesn't want to interact with you. And I walked out. That was a rare instance. They normally behave more sensibly than that when you push conspiracy theorists over the edge to prove their conspiracy theory. Now, at any given point, any one of us could become a conspiracy theorist. All it takes is a temporary or long-term disconnection from reality. This can happen due to stress. This can happen due to a minor or moderate mental illness. This could even happen due to brain damage or to simple temporary psychosis, which many people experience. Temporary psychosis being the condition of disconnection from reality, and it can be temporary due to stress or a head injury or even just a simple state of heightened emotion. A simple state of heightened emotion or a knee-jerk reaction. If your mode of thinking is more emotional, then it is logical. If it's more of an emotional mode of thinking, then you're more likely to experience temporary psychosis due to a heightened state of emotion and someone saying something to you or doing something to you that is triggering. And you can experience a state of temporary psychosis due to heightened emotion, because it is only the logical center in your brain in the prefrontal cortex that prevents psychosis and grounds you in reality via logic. These disconnections with reality are often subtle and can be hard to detect for the individual who's experiencing the disconnection. I've experienced this many times myself. I've experienced disconnection from reality due to stress, largely, temporary psychosis due to a heightened state of emotion, being angry, being very, very angry, and imagining someone as sort of a penultimate evil, right? Imagining someone worse than they really are. I've done this. Many others have done this. This is a very normal thing that can cause temporary psychosis. And it is in these moments that actually cause conspiracy theorists to arise. Someone who has simply lost their connection with reality. And why I mention this in regards to 1/6 is because many people dismissed 1/6 as a conspiracy theory. I'm basically going to mention that the idea of it being an insurrection is the conspiracy theory, and the idea that it's being rigged or being manufactured was not a conspiracy theory, but in fact the truth. As I said, there's the video evidence of the officer making a hand gesture saying, "Come on in." They let a bunch of people in because they knew they could then use that situation to create a panic among more easy-to-influence people. The mainstream media would go on with it, and they'd push it, and people would go a little nuts. You would get things like everything's going to be all white, pushing the 1/6 conspiracy about it being an insurrection, saying that they were storming the Capitol, when it was really just a bunch of Capitol protesters being guided into the building by Capitol Police so they could create a manufactured crisis to scare people with. Right. So here is the concept also of what they call world wisdom. This is your common everyday grounding in reality. Because world wisdom, quite simply put, is the wisdom about the world acquired through lived experiences, and also from taking your book smarts and applying them out there in the real world. Right? If a book tells you to do X and Y should occur, and then you do X and Y occurs, you applied what that book taught you, and you learned something, and you gained wisdom through that application. Wisdom is the understanding of knowledge, and the only way to gain it is through applying knowledge that you've acquired in some form. And generally speaking, that wisdom will ground you in reality. It may also be that a conspiracy theorist is someone who lacks wisdom. And if you lack wisdom in the nature of politicians and politics and how they operate, then obviously you can come to the conspiracy theory that it was an insurrection by Trump supporters, when in reality it was a bunch of luckless simps, so to speak, who were simply guided by Capitol Police to manufacture a crisis. Many of them were QAnon. And the QAnoners are conspiracy theorists who believe that the original satanic panic was legitimate, and that there are satanic pedophile cannibals, mostly in government, and they want to start a second satanic panic. They would like to have the McMartin kindergarten case happen again, a second time. And for those of you who are familiar with that, that is a very horrifying thing that happened. And they would like to have that incident basically repeat itself. So there were some of those present. There was the Q Shaman, a famous member of the QAnon group. There were several other QAnon supporters, but it was mostly hapless people who didn't know what was going on. And the left-wing conspiracy theorists who watch CNN all day, and then CNN throws fuel onto the fire of the left-wing conspiracy theories like Russiagate and Pissgate and Donald Trump's a Russian asset, etc., amplified the 1/6 hoax. Yes, I said that 1/6 was a hoax. And they amplified that incident in order to essentially push this narrative onto naive, easy-to-influence liberals who would think it was all real. Now, there of course are right-wing conspiracy theorists. There's QAnon, and there's also Alex Jones, well-known conspiracy theorist and similar. And what's interesting about Alex Jones and people who are similar to Alex Jones, it's that sometimes they do get a thing or two correct. They do make one or two evaluations that turn out to be legitimate. For example, when Alex Jones was talking about Barack Obama putting chemicals in the water that turned the frogs homosexual. Well, what's interesting about that is that there were chemicals being dumped in the water. What it was is that certain species of frog have the ability to change gender in an environment where the ratio of male to female is off balance, and as a result, their reproductive numbers go down. Some species have evolved the ability to change gender. Some species of flatworm, for example, two males will fight each other. They will bash genitals as a way of fighting, and the loser is forced to become female and then forcibly impregnated by the other male. Or, in the case of these frogs, some frogs can switch gender from male to female as needed in order to reproduce. Also note there's no demonstrable differences in the general behavior of male and or female outside of sexual reproduction in this species. You would not be able to tell a male frog from a female frog. If you saw this frog when it was male and then transitioned itself to female as needed to reproduce, you otherwise would not be able to tell a difference. So that's sort of interesting about these frogs. But what was going on is Barack Obama was putting chemicals in the water, or at least his EPA was putting chemicals in the water that caused these frogs to change gender at times when it was not required for them to do so in order to reproduce. Their numbers were balanced, and then the chemicals caused them to transition prematurely. And as a result, they transitioned at an inappropriate time because of the chemicals in the water. And what's interesting about this is that Alex Jones, he's like my mother in that my mother will read news articles and she'll repeat headlines and topics back to the listener in a way that is distorted. She'll distort what she hears or reads because she'll remember it incorrectly. And it's sort of like the game of broken telephone. Basically, with Mr. Jones, it's essentially the same thing. He reads an article and repeats it back in a distorted way by the game of broken telephone because he remembers something incorrectly, or he distorts it in some way because he doesn't fully understand. It was not that the chemicals were turning the frogs gay. It's that the frogs were transitioning at a time when they didn't need to because the chemicals were influencing their hormones. So sometimes conspiracy theorists actually get things right. It's just that a lot of the time the information has been distorted due to their lack of proper grounding in reality or due to a flawed memory, resulting in a distortion of the information. So, this is why you should entertain conspiracy theorists and why I always do. because there's always the chance they might be right. And if it turns out that the conspiracy theory is real, then obviously that's horrible. The thing to do is not to silence conspiracy theorists. The thing to do is to ask them for evidence, pressure them for evidence, stress them out if you have to, stress them hard, and then wait for the evidence to be presented to you. And if the evidence is good, then compliment them on their good evidence. Let them know, like, yes, this was good, thank you. Thank you for your evidence. And if the evidence is bad, politely tell them, like, hey, I'm sorry, but this is not convincing. That is a better way to deal with it. Leave the conspiracy theorists out in the open and simply challenge them on their ideas, and they will stop being conspiracy theorists, if they are reasonable. If they're not reasonable, then obviously they won't abandon it. But at least then you will have successfully debunked the conspiracy theory. When you silence their voice and force them into the dark, you have to understand that there is such a thing as an information marketplace, where ideas are exchanged like a currency. And like marketplaces, you create black markets anytime you push something into the dark. It continues to grow and grow in the shadows, where it can no longer be dealt with. Out of sight, out of mind. It's easier to deal with a market than it is with a black market. And when you have a black market for ideas, conspiracy theories will grow. It is better to leave them out in the open in the regular market of information, where they can be challenged on their ideas and deconverted from their ideology or debunked as needed. And that will actually be of greater benefit to society, because then the conspiracy theory will eventually go away. And many times it's also safe to simply ignore them. It depends on the situation. If you meet a conspiracy theorist, some rando on social media, and then it's probably best that you actually challenge them right then and there. Just remember to be polite, respectful. PPR. Peaceful, persuasive, respectful is the terminology, PPR. It's a solid tactic used in politics these days, especially by the right-wing and centrist sources. Sometimes by center liberals or disaffected liberals will use it if they're still reasonable and not far left. Now, at the end of the day, I can only encourage critical thought or critical thinking. For example, once again, 1/6, when the government says, the Capitol building was broken into, it was an insurrection. Critical thought is the process by which we ask questions in order to determine the truth. The first time a child is able to think critically is around 5. They can't think logically, but they can think critically at 5, which is why a 5-year-old's favorite question is why. That's the critical thought process, which has just begun biologically going amok. Essentially, what you want to do is you want to think like a 5-year-old and just be critical and ask questions. Endlessly, if need be. And in a government under that kind of scrutiny may not survive long if they are genuinely engaging in something that would best be hidden from the public. So you understand, then, that critical thinking is vitally important. You ask yourself the question, did they really try an insurrection? Did they really storm the Capitol? What does the video evidence say? The video evidence says that the whole thing was rigged. An officer ushered them into the building, and then they went inside. And they took a bunch of photos doing silly stuff, and then they were just being rambunctious idiots for the better part of an hour. And then, of course, they took that, the so-called journalists in CNN and MSNBC took that and they exaggerated it and made it into a bigger, scarier thing than it really was. They can always be counted on to essentially produce that variety of nonsense. Right, you can always count on the mainstream media to do that sort of thing, to distort everything that is done and everything that is said to their advantage for clicks and views. If you remember the Nick Sandmann case, falsely accused of harassing a Native American, because they always assume that if a white person and non-white person are in an engagement and one is harassing the other, they assume that the harasser is the white guy. But that was CNN's mistake, and now Nick Sandmann was able to sue them for defamation. Because as it turns out, the Native American gentleman, Nathan Phillips, was the racist one. I just called him a gentleman. I am sorry. Asshole. The asshole Native American was the racist one. So you understand that you have to take critical thought into account and ask questions of the media. And if you do, you will find more often than not that they cannot be trusted. It was a simple break-in that was guided by a police officer because it was in order to manufacture a crisis. You guide them into a controlled break-in. You trick a bunch of unwitting Trump supporters into a building to manufacture a crisis. This is one of those times where the conspiracy theorists were actually right. The conspiracy theorists were correct. It was a faked insurrection. It was a faked break-in. There are multiple standards of evidence which need to be considered. Also, this is a very important aspect. Multiple standards of evidence, such as, for example, the standard of evidence first is empiricism. Then a second standard of evidence is hands-on experience. The third standard of evidence is a sufficient number of anecdotes. And each anecdote should be slightly different from the other. Because if they're all identical, then it's rehearsed. But if they're different from one another ever so slightly, that's because of POV. The POV causes the anecdote to be different. And then finally, the fourth standard of evidence, which is some sort of, basically a kind of logical syllogism that causes the event to make sense. This is a fairly weak standard of evidence, but it's a great place to start. Because if you can make it seem logical and make it make sense, then you can that shows that it can happen in reality. And then if it can happen, then the individual has obviously asked the question, if it can, did it? If it can happen, did it happen? So these are important standards of evidence. To review, empiricism, which is physical evidence. Second standard of evidence, personal experience. Were you there? Did you experience it? 3, collected anecdotes that corroborate each other but are also slightly different because they come from different points of view. And then finally, the fourth standard of evidence, which is logical syllogism. These are important. And oftentimes when pressed for a logical syllogism, your average conspiracy theorist fails to even provide that. And at the end of the day, it is very important to ask the person that you check all possibilities. Is it possible that the event was faked? Is it possible that the conspirators do not need it to be fake in order to get what they want? Can you have a real school shooting and then stand on the corpses of those kids in order to sermonize about why gun control is necessary? Check all possibilities before you reach your conclusion. Make sure that there are no explanatory gaps in your conclusion. An explanatory gap being a gap of data created any time your explanation fails to take all of the facts into account. If any facts are excluded, that is an explanatory gap, and that matters, because explanatory gaps can lead you to a false conclusion, because there's something you left out. So at the end of the day, it's important that we ask these questions, to think critically, to ask for standards of evidence, and to make certain that conspiracy theorists are entertained, because sometimes they're right. Alex Jones was right about Bohemian Grove. He had the footage. I've personally seen it. They were doing taboo rituals. Not that I care that they're taboo, because I do many spiritual taboo things myself. But the fact that they were doing it in secret as a conspiracy lends credence to not only Jones, but to the fact that there are secret societies in America with a great deal of influence. And remember that even our first president, George Washington, was wary of things like the Freemasons and other such. Anyway, with that being said, there will be a link in the description below to my books. Please buy, download, read them, and as always, choose peace.